Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us tonight on this Sunday night. We really appreciate you taking some time on your Sunday. So many familiar faces out there, big smile from a lot of people. We're very lucky tonight. We've had a lot of virtuals in our chapter, but tonight we have, honestly, we're just blessed with a really wonderful guest. Joe Posnanski is one of the great authors. There was a great quote in a press release that said, the Wall Street Journal, and Joe, you're going to blush, so here we go. The Wall Street Journal calls him contemporary sports writing biggest star. Now, I've been by him. He's not that tall, so I think they're talking about the magnitude of his writing. But Joe Posnanski is one of the great writers in today. This guy loves baseball like we love baseball at SABR. There's a great bit in his book, and Joe, I'm going to out you. They're going to read it. But Joe said sometimes to fall asleep, he counts the ballparks that he's visited. The problem, Joe, I did that after reading the book, and it kept me up for 40 minutes writing down the ballparks. So I will not recommend that one. As a result, I came up with 62 at the big league level. But Joe has authored, I believe, 6 previous books. Is that
That's
correct?
right.
He grew up a Cleveland Indians fan, and we'll chat about that a little bit. Now he lives, I believe, in Charlotte, North Carolina. His last book, The Baseball 100, is one of the finest books I've ever read. I still debate with friends about it. He also read a great book about Joe Paterno. He wrote a book, The Secret of Golf, which I have not unlocked because I shot a 93 the other day. He's the 5-time National Sports Writer of the Year. I highly recommend subscribing to his joeposnanski.com. He was one of the trendsetters years ago when he went out on his own and posted things on his own. And now his Joe Blogs subscription is absolutely a wonderful thing to get. On Twitter, he's at Joe Posnanski. And Joe, we're just really proud to have you here. Joe is a SABR member. And as I said earlier, Joe loves this sport like we love this sport. Joe, on September 5th, has a new book coming out called Why We Love Baseball. And it oozes Joe's love of the game. His publicity people at Penguin were kind enough to send me an advance copy. And very candidly, it is one of the best baseball books I've ever read. And it's out in a week, September 5th. So, Joe, welcome to the Rocky Mountain SABR chapter. We're thrilled to have you here tonight.
Thank you. I'm thrilled to be here. This is my first sort of event, I guess, for the new book. I'm about to hit the road and do many of these apparently. But I'm excited to get started, and I'm excited to be with you, Dan, and to sort of kick this book off a little bit with the Rocky Mountain Sabres. That's cool.
Fantastic. For everybody's sake, I reached out to Joe about 3 months ago when his blog was posting, it was actually more than 3 months ago, about the new book. And I said, Joe, I'd really love to do something. And his publicity people were great. And so we get to lead off. We get to be the Ricky Henderson of
Yes.
Joe's tour. So Joe, I mean, so much to chat about. I'm gonna bounce around and everything, and everybody. Alex is moderating the chat room. We'll do questions after Joe and I are done. He's really happy doing Q&A with the group. But I wanna pick your brain a little bit, and I want to get started. Just, your last book was huge, and it was wonderful, and it got great feedback from the baseball community. How did this second one happen? How did, what occurred to get you to try it? And I'd love to hear your thoughts about where this came from.
Yeah. Thanks, Dan. So the baseball 100 was, you call it huge. It was huge. It was like 860 pages. It was 280,000 words. When I wrote it, I originally wrote it um, online for the Athletic, and so it was a daily thing. And when they said that they wanted to turn it into a book, and it was great. I got incredible support. People emailing me. George Will was one of the people that just really, really thought it should become a book. I love that book, but I didn't have particularly high expectations. It's a 860 page baseball book at a time when sports books don't really sell anyway. And so I was like, look, I was thrilled that it was coming out. I was thrilled it was going to be a book. They published it beautifully, but I didn't have necessarily expectations of it being a big seller or anything like that. And it blew my mind what it did. It went to the top of the New York Times bestseller list, and was a bestseller for very long time, and still is selling incredibly well. I mean, it's just a real success, and it was all word of mouth. And I mean, there wasn't like anybody went in with any expectations for that book. So it was all word of mouth, and people talking about it, and people in the game, like you said, really, really commenting on it, which was so, it was so humbling and incredible. And I was trying to think, well, what do I want my next book to be? And, there's I wouldn't call it pressure, because it's, I've been writing books for a long time, but there's an expectation that, hey, this needs, whatever I follow this up with, it needs to be something really, really special. And I was thinking hard about what I wanted it to be. And I just kind of felt like, and I talked about this in the book a little bit. It seems to me that when people talk about baseball, very often what they talk about is baseball is dying, baseball is going away, kids don't love it, it's been surpassed by football, it's being surpassed by basketball, blah blah blah, all that stuff. You've all read it 1,000 times, and of course that story is as old as baseball, right? People were talking about baseball dying 100 years ago. um and I've written about that, I've thought about that, a lot of people have talked about that, but I I really had this sort of new sort of angle on that, which was, the question is not why baseball has to keep winning over the fans. I mean, it's 150 years old. There's nothing that's 150 years old that we still care about. I mean, there's nothing from that time, from the post Civil War, before football even had the forward pass, before basketball was invented. Baseball was America's biggest game. And the question is not why it needs to keep winning people over. The question is why we still love it. Like, why do we still love this game? Why is this game still so much a part of us? And it's the only book I've written so far where I had the title before I started the book. Like every other one of my books, you write it and then I come up with a title, and sometimes we argue about it, sometimes we agree or disagree about it. My first book about Buck O'Neil, where I traveled the country with Buck O'Neil, the original title of that book was Baseball and Jazz, and that's what I wanted it to be. And I kind of, it was my first book. I didn't really have a lot of cachet or confidence about it, and the publishing house did not like the title. They wanted it to call it something else, and of course it ended up being called The Soul of Baseball, which is better probably. But this one, I had the title, I had Why We Love Baseball. That was the book I was going to write. And what form that book took changed numerous times as I was writing it, and as I was thinking about it. But that's what I wanted to write. I felt like the way to follow up the Baseball 100, which to me was, my history of the game through the 100 greatest players ever, their stories, what it is that makes them so special. I wanted to do that for the game. I wanted to do that for baseball. And I thought the best way to do that, I thought a lot about why we love baseball. So that's I'm hoping that you guys will be able to talk to me a little bit about that too, because every time I talk to people about that, I get amazing answers, and amazing thoughts. And what I eventually came down to is I think the reason we love baseball are the moments. And they're not all big moments. They're not all, a lot of them are personal moments, but it's the moments that sort of stay with us. And baseball is better, I think, than any game at creating these incredible moments. And so I'm like, okay, well, what I'm going to do is I'll do a countdown of the greatest, most magical moments in baseball history. That took many, many different forms, which I'm sure we'll talk about. And eventually I got here where I came up with a book that I deeply, deeply love, because I think it's rare, I think, as an author where you come up with an idea and you have this sort of perfect version of it in your mind, and the book sort of comes close to what you originally hoped it would be. And that's what this book ends up being. So that's the story for me.
So Joe, first of all, folks, this book was unbelievable. I loved it. I marked it up so many times. I mean, there were so many things, but you kind of fudge here because you say there's 50 moments, but you actually give us a bonus and there's 108.
There are 108 moments. It's funny. I was on a radio show today in San Francisco, pregame show, and they were like, "How did you narrow this down to 50 moments? Like, how do you narrow down the history of baseball to 50 magical moments?" And I said, well, what you do, first thing you do is you make it 108 moments and don't tell anybody. You still call it 50 moments, but you just shove a bunch of moments in throughout the book. Yeah, I mean, it was really important to me. What I ended up finding was there are so many different kinds of moments that we love in baseball. Again, I know we'll talk about this at some length, but there are the legendary moments. There are the moments that are important. There are moments that change the game. And then there are a bunch of just funny moments, silly moments, touching moments that you'll never forget. If you were there, you'll never forget. I was talking with Bill Chuck. You guys might know Bill Chuck. Bill did some work with me on this book, helped me with this book. And Bill was talking about how one of his favorite things that he does is he goes up to Red Sox fans and said, what if I told you could go back to a Red Sox game that was 8-0 against the Kansas City Royals, middle of the season, meaningless game at Fenway Park, and I told you that you could go back, and that's the one Red Sox game you could go back to see, what would you say? And of course, they're all like, well, no, I don't want to go back to that game. And then he goes, okay, well, what if I tell you it was John Lester's no-hitter? And see, it's sort of like any game can be this incredible, magical moment. And I was at that game. I was at that Lester game, which, I was there on the Kansas City side, but I was at that game. And so I needed to figure out, how do I get all of these different moments into the game, some which are going to be one of the 50 most magical I can easily put in. I'm not worried about getting, Willie Mays' catch in there or whatever. But how am I going to get, say, Kevin Mitchell's barehanded catch right in left field? It didn't mean anything. It was kind of a meaningless game, but I'll never forget it. It's one of the coolest, most, enjoyable moments in baseball history. So I needed to think about all of those things, but that's how it ended up being 108 moments, was trying to find places for not just the magical moments, the most important moments, but also crazy moments, silly moments. And as I know we'll talk about, even moments that never even actually happened, but are still
that's
part
some
of
we're
baseball.
going to talk about, because that was really one of the fun parts about it. All right, so just for everybody, and I know Joe wants you to buy the book, so there's meltdowns. I wrote down there's trick plays, there's loud home runs, there's famous things that happen, there's blunders, there's great catches. I think there's heartbreaks.
There is.
Um, but you did something that really caught my eye early in the book. I wrote on page 25, and Joe, it resonated like hell for me. You talk about the age of 15 and how 15 is kind of a magical age for baseball fans. If you can chat about that, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah. The thing that I love about this to me is I think 10 is a magical age. I think 15 is a magical age. And they're magical in very, very different ways. Like when you're 10 or 9, you go to a baseball game and it feels larger than life. And you see the grass, I mean, I can't tell you how many people I talked to who, when I said, why do you love baseball? They tell me about the first game they ever went to and the first time they ever walked up the concourse and saw the field, just the green of it. And it's, you're in a place that smells like beer and popcorn and cotton candy. I mean, there's nothing like the smell of a baseball game, the sounds of the game, everything about it. And I think when you're really young, when you're 9, 10 years old, it really is magical. It really is like going to Disneyland, it just feels magical. When you're 15, like you understand it a bit. You know what I mean? Like you've been collecting baseball cards. You've got your heroes. You've played the game. By 15, maybe you're playing in high school, or maybe you want to play in high school, or maybe you've sort of had your little league career, but you still love, playing catch and playing the game. Like it's inside you at that point. And I think going to a game at 15, what I say all the time is the most perfect version of baseball is the baseball that was played when you were 15 years old. Like that'll always be. So when I was 15 years old, that was 1982. So it was, speed on the bases and great defense and triples and it was the Royals and Cardinals and that was perfect. Where home runs were rare, and a 30 home run guy was a power hitter. If I was 15 in 1997, be different, right? Like suddenly now it's about power and home runs and incredible legendary pitchers. If I was 15 in 1954, again, completely different. So I think to me that as you get older, it still always reverts back to that time when you were 15 years old.
Yeah, Joe, there are so many nodding heads in the gallery. I think we all identify. I know I did. 1975, Game 6 World Series. I was 15 years old.
Yeah.
And I woke my entire house up when he hit the home run off of Darcy. So for me, that's a big deal. So I want to just jump into some fun stuff because the book is full of fun things. You wrote about something that I didn't know anything about that brought a huge smile to my face, and that is Game 6 of the 1947 World Series, with Al Gianfrido making a great catch off of Joe DiMaggio that all of us have seen on film. It's October 6, 1947. And on page 313, I could not believe what I read. And if you don't mind, I'd love you to run through it.
Yeah. Well, Dan, it's sort of perfect because it is the biggest surprise for me of the entire book, for me. And I think if you are a certain kind of baseball fan, and I think that I'm talking to a bunch of people who are like this, who love history, right? Obviously, I wasn't around in 1947. You weren't around in 1947. And yet we've all seen that famous Gianfrido catch of DiMaggio, right? He goes back to the wall and makes the catch. and DiMaggio kicks the dirt, and it's legend, right? It's complete legend. DiMaggio never responding like that, to a play, right? He was always the coolest guy on the field, and yet, and there was something about that play that always bothered me, and to the point where I almost didn't put it in the book. Like, I considered not putting it in the book because there was something about the play that bothered me. And the thing that bothered me is it's not that good a catch. Like, when you see it on film, on video film, it's like, yeah, it's fine. He didn't rob a home run. He kind of stumbled around. It was, it's like, why did DiMaggio kick the dirt on that play? And I thought, it's weird. Like, I should include it because it's magical and it's a part of baseball history, but there's something always about that play that bothered me. And so I went back and did like a research on the play, because I was like, something about this really troubles me. And I found out something that so blew my mind that I wrote to Costas. I wrote to Bob Costas and said, Bob, I found out something about the Al Gianfrido play that can't be right. It cannot be right. And yet I think it is right. And I need to know your advice on this. And so he and I went over it, and he agreed that it was right. What we have been watching on the Gianfrido video of that play, the film of that play, it's a reproduction of it. He did it the next day. They did not get Gianfrido's catch on film. And the next day, the people who were running the newsreels sent out cameras to have him reproduce the catch. And they hit a bunch of fly balls to him and kind of got one that sort of looked like the play, and he kind of tried to reenact it. But that's not the actual play. And I can't believe it. It's such a legendary moment in baseball. There's no historic baseball fan who hasn't seen that play again and again. And I that can't be right. It cannot, nobody's told us that this was a reproduction of the play. But if you look at it, and this is what I was trying, and I see Ed's question, by the way, I see it come across, and I have an answer for that question. If you look at it, there was no camera that could have gotten the shot. That's what Costas eventually came to, because Costas also was like, that can't be right. But then he was like, yeah, there would be no camera. They had two cameras there. There'd be no camera that would be on Gianfrido going back to the play that would be able to get that kind of a close-up of him. And the funny thing is, if you look in the background, they asked people in the stands to cheer, and some do and some don't. And it's an amazing thing. Ed's question was DiMaggio's kick real? Was that a real thing of him kicking the dirt? And that was what Costas asked too. And I don't know, of course, but my answer is yes. I think the camera got him kicking the dirt, because there's no way he would have reproduced that. There's no possible way they would have gotten Joe DiMaggio to reproduce that. So my guess is, and by the way, there are stories about the reproduction. I'm not just guessing on this. There are stories written about it, and reporters talking about how silly Gianfrido looked, kind of going back and making the same catch over and over again while the crowd pretended to cheer. And this was before the next day's game. So it was it was this, which tells
before
you now,
game 7 of the World Series.
Yeah, before. Could you imagine now, like Fox going up to some player now before game 7 of the World Series and saying, hey, listen, we didn't get a good shot of that. Could you just do that again for us a few times? And it just tells you what a different time it was. But it's funny. I really wondered when I wrote it, I think some people like you, Dan, and people here who are big baseball historians and love the history of the game, I think that's going to be one of your favorite things in the entire book. It was one of mine. And I think a lot of other people are going to read right over it, because they're they're more modern fans. They don't love, they don't care that much about the history. Maybe they've never even seen the video.
Yeah.
For me, it was mind blowing though. Absolutely mind blowing.
Oh, that's great. I loved it. I was giggling out loud. It was really fun. So now let's do a local guy. Um, June 2nd, 1987, Joey Meyer, and not the DePaul head coach. Joey Meyer, playing in Denver, hits a 582-foot home run
Yeah.
that I'm sure some of the people on this virtual, being from Denver, are very aware about. Could you talk about that?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm sure maybe somebody was there. I mean, it was obviously it was at a uh, minor league game at the time. It was played at the old football stadium. I mean, it was played before Coors Field, obviously. Um, and there's video of it. And the great thing about the video, it is the longest home run ever hit that I think we've measured. Now, I mean, there are other home runs, Mantle and Ruth and others that have been said to be measured longer, but it is the one that we know is the longest. And my favorite part of the video of it, which you can see on YouTube, is they're like, oh, that's long gone. And it goes out of the camera. So we never see the ball land. It kind of goes through the top of the camera, and it never comes down. You never see it come down. It could be 1,000 feet. Like there's no way. They did measure it eventually, or at least measured, sort of based on the trajectory or everything. We went way, way, way up into the upper deck, at the old field. And I love that. One of the things that I loved about doing this book is so like the Baseball 100 was so wonderful to write, but it was limiting because I was only writing about greatness, right? I was only writing
Yeah.
about the greatest players ever. And whether or not, I got, the ones that did not get into the book, that I thought about, they were also great. I mean, it was just the greatest baseball players ever and their stories. And this book to me it captures a whole other element of baseball, which is that Joey Meyer could hit the longest home run that's, maybe ever been hit, like people
Right.
you don't know, people who had, either no major league career. There's several people in the book that had never got to the major leagues, or had very, very small major league careers and had one moment, or, just basically there's a moment here that I love, where John McDonald hits a home run on Father's Day, that many of you might
Yes.
remember. And I love, love, love that story so much. And what makes it great is that John McDonald wasn't a home run hitter. I mean,
That's right.
that is literally what makes it the story that it is. Same thing with when D. Gordon hit the home run for Jose Fernandez. And
Yeah.
so that's a whole other wonderful side of baseball, which is everybody can like have a moment, a day, a swing, a pitch that, alters the history of the game. And you don't have to be Willie Mays to do that. And so I love that so much.
Yeah. And there are Willie Mays. There are Babe
And
Ruth.
of course
There
there's Willie
are,
Mays. Yes.
right. I mean, there's a great story about Tris Speaker that was fabulous. But I think you get a lot of everyman. You get a lot of elements that, I don't care how much of a savant the 41 of us are on this call, it just brings a smile to your face and a grin. So, one of those moments, and Alex, if you're ready, I'm not ready to quite cue it up, but one of the greatest comebacks in the history of baseball is captured. And I was stunned because I did not think that this game would ever, this great 94-run comeback would be caught in a book the magnitude of such a great writer. So Alex, can you cue up that video, and for everybody just a real quick video? You may remember this great comeback when you see it come up here.
I think I'll perplex him with my slow ball. 1, 2, 3 strikes, you're out. 1, 2, 3 strikes, you're out. 1, 2, 3 strikes, you're out. Stick him up. You're under arrest.
So Joe talks about Bugs Bunny versus the Gas House Gorillas in a 1946 video that we've probably all seen. Even Chris Cohen at 25 has probably seen that. Joe, can you talk about that and how that wonderful moment got into the book?
Yeah, one of the things that I tried to do with this book was just get everything in there about why we love baseball. So there are fictional moments in this book. There are movie moments in this book. There are, there's Bugs Bunny in this book. I think that to me, there was like, I was thinking hard about putting the Simpsons baseball episode in the book because I love that so much. And I was thinking, look, at this point, there are no rules. I can put whatever I want. It's my book. I can do whatever I want. and I started, so that sort of got me thinking about should there be an animated moment in this book? And if there is one, as I started to think, it's got to be Bugs Bunny against the Gas House Gorillas. And the really, really fun part for me about that was I wrote the essay about that Gas House Gorillas game, and then my wife reads and edits all of my books and things, and she like the rest of the book, she's like, yeah, okay, I did this and this. But for the Gas House Gorillas one, she watched it 6 times and was like, wait a minute, you got the score wrong in the 7th inning. And she went through it literally minute by minute by minute to make sure that every single thing, it was the one essay she wanted to protect from the start. I think it's just wonderful and so fun one of the reasons why we love baseball.
That's right. Well, they blew a 94-run lead. I mean, don't you
Yeah.
change pitchers
to
at
one
some
guy,
point?
to one guy. I mean, come on. I mean, it's
Yeah,
you got to do a little bit better than that.
I think so. You think the pitching coach survived that game? I think he got canned at the end of that ball game. I'm going to ask you one more, and then we're going to open it up. And one of the one of many fun stories was Mr. October. And we all have this image about Mr. October, but you polished that stone for me, and I saw a very different Mr. October. If you could talk about that.
Yeah. You picked another one of my favorite chapters in the book. So you're looking at the first thing I did when I started to write this book, and it's funny, this group won't be as interested, perhaps. I'm writing a football book now, and so I just did this with football as well. First thing I did was just scribble down moments that had to be in the book. It's like the most famous moments. And so I wrote Willie Mays' catch and the shot heard around the world and Kirk Gibson's home run and this, and I put Reggie's 3 home runs. And that's, but as you know, Dan, because you've now gotten to read it, with every moment, I wanted something that people didn't know, something that's a completely different angle. And I was like, well, what don't people know about Reggie's 3 home run game? And we've seen it a million times. Reggie's talked about it a million times. What do we not know? And I talked to a couple of people who were at the game and tried to get a little something. And, they gave me perfectly fine stuff, but it wasn't new or anything. And I was doing the research, as we all do. And how one of the coolest things about doing research is when you come across something else, right? And I'm doing the research leading up to that game. And I realized I started looking, nobody was calling him Mr. October. And I thought, well, that's weird. And I was like, well, when was he first called Mr. October? When did that first happen? And it was like 3 or 4 days before he hit the 3 home runs. And I'm like, well, that's interesting, because it was the first time I was coming up on my search. And I go, well, what? How did he get the nickname Mr. October? And then the story behind how he got the nickname Mr. October, to me, is one of my all-time favorite things. It's so great because it is perfectly Reggie Jackson. There are 2 elements of it. The first element is he named himself Mr. October, which I don't think anybody would be too surprised by. The second thing is that he named himself Mr. October when he really wasn't playing well in October. Like he, in that playoffs that might remember, he was abysmal in the championship series. And then he really started off that World Series very slowly. And he got the nickname because Thurman Munson, Reggie was complaining about something, and they went to Thurman Munson to ask him about it. And Thurman Munson said, hey, why don't you go ask Mr. October over there? Why don't you go ask that guy? You know, the one that calling himself Mr. October. I mean, he's hitting 220, so he's the perfect guy to ask. So Mr. October started as like this derisive nickname that Thurman Munson used. And then 3 days later, he hits 3 home runs in a World Series, and now he's Mr. October forever. So I love that very much.
Oh, that was great. That was so much fun. So a couple things before we turn it over. And we do this a lot when you come into our chapter, Joe. We have a little fun with everybody. We always, Kurt Wells is kind of our goodwill ambassador and always ask people to tell a little bit about themselves. So we're going to out you a little bit here. Grew up in Cleveland, favorite team?
Growing up, favorite team?
Yes.
Cleveland. Oh yeah. Cleveland was the team. In fact, if you get the book, the very first moment is about not only my favorite team, but my favorite player ever. Yeah.
It was a fabulous story too. I don't want to pull everything out of the book. How about favorite player? Now you talk about a lot of really wonderful guys that I can tell you've got passion for. Who's the person that just stops you in your tracks when you watch footage or when you see him today?
So is the question favorite player, like as far as to watch, like the most amazing player that I've ever seen?
Just to appreciate. Yeah.
I mean, it's so, I don't want recency bias to affect this, but how can you not say Shohei? I mean, he just utterly blows my mind nightly, you know, and I talk about that a lot in this book. So this book actually goes from 19th century right up to Shohei. My favorite player, though, to watch, sort of the one that I loved was Greg Maddux. Like I would circle his starts on the calendar just so I could watch Maddux pitch. And that'll always be something really, really special for me. I love, you know, you and we've all done this, but I mean, I've been so lucky to see it. So many amazing play. I mean, watching Pujols or watching Bonds or watching Mike Trout, or I mean, there's a million players that we could say. But Shohei is now on a whole other level. I mean, it's heartbreaking that, you know, the pitching thing, who knows? But for the last 3 years, he's been just a joy.
So we all have guys growing up, and you're growing up in Cleveland, and some of the guys you love are those nondescript guys who just did something. Who was that guy for you?
Well, there you go. There's my first chapter of the book. My favorite guy, my favorite player, was Dwayne Kuiper, and he will always be my favorite player. Despite the fact that he hit 1 home run in his big league career. And like, he kind of was famous for that. What he was not as famous for is he had the second worst stolen base percentage of any player who I think tried to steal 100 bases. And first on that list is Buddy Bell, who was also a childhood hero of mine. So apparently a lot of busted hit and runs in Cleveland back when I was growing up. I can only assume. But those guys that I grew up loving, like the first, I was 10 in 1977, 15 in 82. So those guys, like I have become friends with Dale Murphy, talking about an amazing guy. But I'm still in awe. Like there's a feeling of awe that I feel talking to the players like George Brad and Dale Murphy and Mike Schmidt and Johnny Bench and guys that I grew up watching feel even more amazing to me than guys later that I covered and wrote about. There's just a different feeling, I think.
Yeah, no question. All right. So Alex, and by the way, one of the moments you talk about in there is the Bartolo home run, which I was lucky enough to be at that game. And his
Yes.
31-second trout. It was hilarious. We were just, all of us in the scouting area were laughing at the whole time. But I kept my stopwatch on and I looked at the stopwatch and I thought, that's actually the slowest trot I've ever seen. And somebody had the great line in your book about, no, that might have been the speed he actually runs.
Yes.
So
yeah, that was what
I
the
can
announcer
attest
said.
to that.
I always love the fact that it took Bartolo Colon longer to round the bases than it took Kirk Gibson to round the bases, like on one leg. Like Kirk Gibson on one leg faster than Bartolo Colon.
Game one of the World Series for
Game
those of you who never saw it. All right, so we're going to open it up to questions. Joe, this has been wonderful. I just am so appreciative. Either put your hand up, or if we have the chat room, if you could operate in the chat room with Alex. Alex, you moderate it. Let's go.
Thank you, sir. So our first question comes from James Orcutt. Do you think the Rockies could someday build a consistently contending team, or does the altitude just pose too big of a challenge?
It's a great question. I'd be interested to hear what Dan thinks about that. Yeah, I think of course they could. I don't think the elevation should prevent them from building a great team. I just think it has been very, very hard for them to figure it out. And it is a different challenge than pretty much any other team has. But I don't know that it's fundamentally different than it is in, say, Arizona, where, the altitude is tough there too, or in other great hitters parks. It seems to me that what I've never really understood about the Rockies, and of course Rockies have had some success, so we're not talking about a team that's, been completely barren. What I've never been able to figure out by the Rockies is it always seems that they should understand the altitude 10 times better than anybody else, right? Like they should understand exactly what kind of pitching works, and they should scout to that. They should understand exactly what kind of hitters can be successful, not only in the altitude, but also on the road, better than anybody else. And they just haven't gotten that advantage, and you see them make moves like the Chris Bryant move, which was just like, I don't know how they thought that would work. You know what I mean? And that to me is what's tough. I think, yes, absolutely. But I think they should be able to take advantage of the altitude. They should have the best home field record in baseball pretty much every year, because they should be able to build to that altitude. They should be able to build. And look, some of that has gone away too with the humidor and everything else. But it seems to me like that absolutely is not only possible, but it has surprised me that they haven't really done that yet. And I think that's what they need to do.
My take, Joe, would be I think they get in their own way as much or more than any team in the game. And I think the fact that they have a very small analytics squad indicates some of that issue. I think I agree with you. I'd want to master that home environment and have the advantage, but they've never taken a liking to that. And look where they're going to be. They're probably not going to win 60 games this year.
No, no,
Um,
and not, and like you say this, but um what's next year going to look like? You know what I mean? It's not just like, I look at the Royals, and the Royals are having a disastrous season, but the Royals next year are going to be like, we've got Bobby Witt Jr. and a couple of other young players, and we're developing some pitching, and we're heading in the right direction, even though this year was a disaster. And the
Right.
Rockies, I look and I go, they're the same team next year. Like, I don't see what they're doing that is going to get them to another level. And it's, we've also seen it many times. Teams just get into those lulls that nothing seems to work right, and it's tough. I get that too.
A friend of mine once called it, Joe, the life preserver mode.
Yeah.
So, Alex, keep going.
Okay, I think you've already addressed this one, Joe, but it's from Keith Johnson, where he talks about research shows if you love something at age 10, you'll probably love that thing for the rest of your life. Joe, what was your baseball interest like when you were 10 years old?
I loved it. I love baseball from my youngest memories. My very first memories are, playing, my dad pitching a ball to me. I mean, I'm a first generation American. My parents moved to the US just a couple of years before I was born. And my father just had this belief that in order to raise an American son, and 3 American sons as it turned out, he needed to know baseball. Like, baseball was that was a huge part for him about being an American. And I've just carried that with me since I was a very little kid. I loved playing. I loved collecting baseball cards. I loved checking the box scores every day. I was a baseball nut, really, from a very young age. And in fact, I say this in the book, and it's true. One of the sort of motivations for me writing this book was, we used to have this library that was a couple of blocks away from our house. And I would go there all the time, hoping to find a new sports book. It was a very small library, and there were very, very, but every now and again, like Ron Guidry's biography would show up or something, and I would get all excited. And I one of the motivations of writing this book was, I wanted to write a book that me as a kid going into that library would have freaked out if that book showed up. That's kind of what I wanted this book to be.
But you nailed it. You got it. When I was 10 years old, if this book would have been in my library, it might have come home with me. There's a really good chance.
Next question from John Salvino. Can you imagine the TV crew trying to interview Casey Stengel in the dugout during Game 7?
I would love that so much, right? Like they'd be like, well, Casey, we got to go to commercial. And he'd just still be going on, trying to, telling 12 different versions of the story. Yeah, I wonder, I mean, here's the thing that's crazy is, back then they would do anything to promote baseball. I mean, the Gianfrido story is a perfect example. The media, there was no capability to do the things that they do now. But if they'd had the capability, Casey Stengel absolutely would have been mic'd up I mean, I think just about all of them. Like later, Earl Weaver and those guys wouldn't have, but like Casey Stengel, I mean, he would have loved it. He would have, if they told him he was like allowed to announce the game while managing it, he probably would have done that. I mean, it would have been perfect for him. So, yeah, that would have been a lot of fun to have Casey mic'd up.
Alex, I have a question for Joe. At one point, Joe, on page 267, you say, nobody will ever hit in 56 straight games again. Can you tell us why you think that?
It's just a mathematical impossibility. I mean, there are those that have talked about, like, what the odds are, and people who have figured it out, and basically said, I mean, I remember somebody, maybe some of you will know who it was, talked about how it's the most mathematically improbable thing that has ever happened like in anywhere, right? Is somebody hitting in 56 straight games. And of course, now it's not even conceivable, right? Because I mean, nobody's, I mean, batting averages are at a low and strikeouts are at a high, and if somebody gets 10 or 12 consecutive games with a hit, it's already kind of a big deal. Guys can have like amazing thing. I mean, we just saw Julio Rodriguez have 17 hits in 4 games, which had never happened before. So there's still amazing things that can happen, but 56 games, 2 months, a hit every single day, that's never going to happen again.
I agree. Go ahead, Alex.
So Dixie Taranga, apologies if I mispronounce it, asked, isn't that Gianfrido's catch where we all get Red Barber's, oh, doctor?
Oh, that's right. I think that's right.
Was that?
I think that's right. Yeah, when he just screams that, oh, doctor, yeah.
He finishes by asking, was that recorded after the fact as well?
Good question. And I don't know the answer. It kind of feels like it probably was, looking back on it, but I don't know. Here's the thing about those, they didn't record those World Series games. I mean, this was 47. So they probably had to have him redo it, would be my guess. My guess is that almost all calls that were on newsreels were not live calls. They were redone. So my guess is that it was done afterward. It's not impossible that it was done live. He probably said, oh, doctor, live also. I mean, like he probably just redid what he had already said. But my guess would be that it was redone after the game.
John Shuri asks, with such an open-ended topic, how did you select the 108 moments, and do you feel you'll end up coming across some moments that you should have included in the book?
I've already come up across like several moments that I wish I had included in the book, and several moments have happened this year that I wish I would have included in the book. The way I did it ended up being like, that was the hardest part. I wrote and rewrote this book more times than any of my other books. There was a moment when it was 100. It was a countdown of the 100. I was going to do it just like the baseball 100. It was going to be 100 moments, and it didn't work. And then at one point I was going to be 42 moments, sort of a Jackie Robinson tribute, with a bunch of essays. It didn't quite work. And what I ended up finding, the book sort of shaped itself around these 50 moments. And then, like Dan was talking about, these clusters that I ended up writing about. And the clusters ended up the way that started was I wanted, so I will tell you another moment that's in the book, was Ozzie Smith's incredible play in Atlanta where he dove to his left, the ball hit a rock, kicked to his right, he barehanded the ball, got up and threw. I think that's the best defensive play ever made. So I knew I was going to include that in the book. And then I thought, well, I mentioned to you already, I want that Kevin Mitchell play in the book also. And I'm like, if I do 50 moments, there's no place for that Kevin Mitchell play. But I want it in the book. Like, I feel like it's a reason we love baseball. I don't need to do a whole big thing on it, but I want that in the book. And then I thought, well, what if I did like 5 great barehanded plays? Have there been 5 great barehanded plays, that in the history of the game? And I was doing it, and I was looking, and I'm like, oh, you know what? There's this moment from the early part of the 20th century, the lightning catch, which I write about in the book, where, the player for the Giants, for Pittsburgh, and in huge lightning storm going on, long fly ball, he jumped up, bare hand catch, just as a strike of lightning hit, widely considered by some the first truly great catch in baseball history. I'm like, oh, that's perfect. There you go. Do I have more, barehanded moments to write about? And so I found these, I found them. I found 5 moments that I really loved. And then I thought, this is what I should do. I should do the magical moments, and then I'll do these clusters, like 5 duels or 5 loud home runs or 5 barehanded plays or 5 funny moments or something like that. And those ended up being the other, 50 plus moments in this book come from these clusters. And so that's sort of how I ended up narrowing it down and finding it. But yeah, there are a lot of play. There are moments that I cut out of this book last minute that I wrote that are full-fledged essays that I love, but I still had to cut them out of the book.
From Brian Werner, Joe, we had Sam McDowell on a Zoom call not too long ago. Any special memories of Sudden Sam? Anything he did that you considered for the book?
There's no Sudden Sam moments in the book. I'm a little young. I never saw him pitch. He was already sort of a ghost by the time, like a legend, by the time that I was old enough to know about baseball. My father saw him pitch. He was one of a kind in so many ways. And I've thought a lot about people like him and how they would make, I've got my book allotment, for the next while, but I've thought for a long time, like people like Sam McDowell would make a great book, like those players that had greatness in them, but are not going to the Hall of Fame and are not, and there have been books like written about like the Hall of Very Good and that kind of thing, which are great. I don't mean that. I don't mean players that were really, really good, but not quite Hall of Famers. That's one thing. I'm talking about players that were like Hall of Famers when they were at their very, very best. They just weren't at their very best for very long. And I mean, I think there was an argument to be made that Sam McDowell might have thrown the hardest, he threw harder than Koufax, they said. And so yeah, so I don't have any memories of McDowell, but I think about him a lot. He's very much a part of the way I look back at baseball.
Keith Johnson asked, how similar or dissimilar is the first draft of what you write compared to the final product? In other words, does your marvelously descriptive writing style come naturally, or do you have to work at it?
Oh, well, first of all, thank you for saying that. Here's it's a very interesting process for me. The hardest part for me is writing the first draft of something, and my favorite part is rewriting the draft. So I'll sometimes just write just to get words on the page, because my favorite part is getting to the rewrite. But interestingly enough, a lot of times I'll get to the rewrite and I'll do the rewrite and I'll look at it and I'll think, I had it better the first time. So a lot of times it is that first sort of stab at it. I think that's when I feel freshest about it, when I feel most, that's when somewhat of, maybe a little bit of inspiration or something comes in. But it's the rewrite that I love. So it's probably a combination of the two things that you're saying. It's a little bit of that first draft. And then it's sometimes, but my favorite part is still getting that first draft and then just doing the rewrite on it.
Ed Baranski asks, did the story about the Ted Williams bat from the Satchel Paige strikeout make it into the book, or will that have to wait for you and Michael Schor to steal it from Cooperstown?
Yeah. So some of you might know this story. I do a podcast with Mike Schor, and we're both utterly infatuated with the idea. We went to Cooperstown together and were given a tour below, and we were shown, we just literally it wasn't picked out. We were going through one of their incredible closets downstairs, and they pulled out a bat, and it turned out to be the bat that Ted Williams was using when Satchel Paige struck him out, when Paige was on the St. Louis Browns. And what's so cool about it is it's signed, and it's broken because Ted Williams lost his mind after striking out, and bashed the bat against the wall. And Ted Williams was on the other side. I mean, Satchel Paige was on the other side, like laughing his head off at Ted Williams losing his mind. So we love that bat. And Mike Shore and I both sort of decided that bat needs to be at the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum in Kansas City. So we've been talking on the podcast about our plan to steal the bat, and we've got like a whole sort of Ocean's 11 like plot to steal the bat. Unfortunately, the Hall of Fame also listens to podcasts, so they're aware of our plan. But no, that story is not in the book, and it could be. There's a better Satchel Paige story in my mind in the book, so I didn't include that. But and a better Ted Williams story. But I love that story, though. I do love that story.
Very good. Dai Kato asks, I have guests from Japan today. Simple question. How do you think about Japanese baseball, and what do you see in the future?
First of all, I love Japanese baseball, and I will tell you there are multiple Japanese baseball stories in this book, including maybe my favorite story of the entire book, which I will not tell you because I want it to be a complete surprise. But there is a Japanese baseball story in this book that is so good that I actually had to go to friends to ask that. There were two different stories about the same player, and I actually had to go to friends and say which of these stories, they're both so good, which of these stories is better, and they chose the one that was better, and I wrote about both of them. But there are multiple Japanese baseball stories in the book. I was lucky enough to go to Japan and see baseball there when the Royals, I was working in Kansas City, and the Royals hired Trey Hillman to be their manager after Trey Hillman had managed in Japan. So I actually went and was there at the Japanese World Series when the perfect game was thrown, which was an amazing thing and a place to be. And that is not even in the book, that perfect game. But yeah, Japanese baseball is amazing. And you know, what we're seeing from Japanese players coming over and how they have changed, you know, Major League Baseball is so wonderful. And you know, it's really interesting when you look at the history of Major League Baseball. It has been the influx first of African-American players in the 40s, Latino players throughout the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, Japanese players in the late 90s with Ichiro, and then you know, and so on, that really give the game the richness that it has now. And it is now truly an international game in a way that that I think is really special.
And Dai-san, a couple of those stories about Japanese baseball, knowing you will love.
Okay, Chris Moyer asked a two-parter. First question, what was one of your favorite memories talking with Buck O'Neil for the Soul of Baseball? Do you want to answer that question first?
Sure. I have way too many memories that are special to me. They just did a documentary about Buck for the Marquee Network in Chicago, which if you have a chance to see, I don't know exactly how it's streaming or whatever, but it's really wonderful. And they were telling, you know, I was telling some Buck stories, and my friend Bob Kendrick, who is president of the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, was telling Buck stories. Bob and I were together for the Soul of Baseball, and he's like a brother to me. So so we heard a million stories. Rather than tell that story, I'll tell you something from the documentary that I did not fully appreciate until I saw it on the documentary. And that is the role that Buck O'Neil played in the life and career of Ernie Banks. And I write about this quite a bit in the book. But, Ernie Banks was a very shy kid who sat in the back of the team bus, kind of kept to himself, was nothing like the, let's play two Ernie Banks that he would become. And it was really Buck O'Neil who brought him out of his shell, and really Buck O'Neil who kind of told him, you got to play this game with love. You gotta, you gotta let yourself be, a part of this game. And I've written that many times, and I knew about that, but they had footage of Buck with Ernie Banks in this documentary. And hearing Ernie Banks talk about that, Ernie Banks basically said, I didn't say two words to anybody. I didn't trust people. I didn't like people. I worried about, anything I said that people would take the wrong way. And he just talked about what Buck O'Neil did for him, how he changed him as a person and as a player. And, that's the Buck O'Neil I knew. I mean, that's the kind of special person that he was. So, I really cling to that. Just seeing Ernie Banks, who's no longer with us, of course, telling that story of Buck O'Neil changing his life really, really touched me in a way that sort of brought him back a little bit for me.
Boy, Joe, we were both lucky to know him. Buck O'Neill's one of the great men I've met I used to love to go to Kansas City and sit down in the scout seat with him. And I'd miss half the game, but I'd get all the game with Buck, and that's all I cared about. Alex, let's do one more question, and then we'll wrap it up.
I'll just give Chris Moore his second part of his question, because I think the next couple are repeat from others, if that's okay, sir.
Okay.
So Joe, Chris Moyer's second part question is, what intrigued or enticed you about Harry Houdini to write a book about him?
Well, good. I'm glad we got into a little Harry Houdini. So I really, it's a too long a story to go into in depth, but as you will not be surprised to know, it begins with baseball. I was approached to write a Babe Ruth book, and I wasn't interested in it. I'd written enough about Babe. Plus, I knew my friend Jane was writing a Babe Ruth book, which she did, which is excellent. But it was the publishing house, and they were like, what would you want to write about Babe Ruth? You can write anything you want. What do you want to write about Babe Ruth? And I said, well, I don't think I want to write about Babe Ruth, but if I did, what I love thinking about with Babe Ruth is how he was, he was timeless in a way that is, unique in sports, in American sports. There's nobody from, I guess golf fans might care about Bobby Jones some, and, but football fans don't care about Red Grange, and basketball fans, there was no, really basketball in his time. And there's something about Babe Ruth that sort of made him spark wonder in people. And I'm fascinated by the idea of wonder and what it is about somebody that can instill that. And I said, but if I was going to do a book like that, the person I want to do it about is Harry Houdini, because here's Harry Houdini, again, we're talking 100 years later. And yet if you talk about somebody who escapes impossibly, you still call him Harry Houdini. He's still a part of the language and a part of the culture. And I'm like, why? What is it about Harry Houdini? And I knew a little bit about him, not a lot. I didn't know anybody in magic. I didn't know anybody in that world at all. but you know what? I mean, I'm at a stage in my life where I want to try something, and I had a great publisher who said, go ahead and go for it. And I basically was just a kid, like cold calling like magicians, and, sending blind emails to like David Copperfield. And I mean, it was just completely random. And this will, for those of you who are a little bit into magic, you might not be surprised by this. Being a sports writer gave me no cachet in that world, none, like zero. Like, no, there wasn't one person who's like, hey, I've read your stuff, I know you. Nobody had heard of me. Nobody had an idea who I was. Nobody knew why I was doing this. Nobody got it at all. But I ended up making some of, the friends that I'm going to have for the rest of my life. I met incredible people, incredible magicians. Their stories about Harry Houdini and about magic were, I hold dear. And I love that book. I ended up writing The Life and Afterlife of Harry Houdini, which is sort of an unconventional biography, not only of Houdini himself, but about, wonder and why we care about him. And it's about all these other younger magicians. I really love that book. So that was, my one sort of like, hey, just go off the deep end and go out and explore and do something. And I love doing it. It was really fun.
Joe, they'd be disappointed in New York if they knew that your MLB credential wasn't a big deal in the magician's world. I think there's some people who'd be devastated. Pat Courtney would be crushed if he heard that. So just starting to wrap it up, I don't want to ruin the book, but we got some Cub fans. There's a Kerry Wood story. There's a story about the embrace. There's a story about Joe Bauman, who's just one of the great all-time stories. The Grand Illusion is in there. I have the bat flip, which is near and dear to my heart. Jackie and Yogi. You got Vinny talking about the Koufax Perfecto. Harvey Haddix, which is an unbelievable bit. I had Jackie Mitchell, and I'll stop and I'll let them find out about Jackie Mitchell. There are some fabulous stories. The Shot Around the World, a Tris Speaker story. It is just loaded, Joe, and it is a wonderful masterpiece. It's one of the best books I have ever read, and not just baseball books. It brought joy. I want to give you the chance to talk about your Joe blogs, to talk about your podcast, to give yourself a plug, and talk about how you can purchase your book before the debut on September 5th.
Yeah, I mean, I would love, of course, if you want to follow me, Joe Blogs, just go to joeposnanski.com and click on Joe Blogs, and it is my daily newsletter where I write about a lot of baseball, but a lot of everything. I just kind of write about whatever sort of is moving me at that moment, whether it's often it's baseball, but sometimes it's Taylor Swift, it could be anything. It really could. My podcast is I do with Mike Schur, as I mentioned. Mike is the incredible television writer who created Parks and Recreation and Brooklyn Nine-Nine and The Good Place. Huge baseball fan. We have been friends for many years, dating back to when he was Mose on The Office, for those of you that are Office fans. We always tell people we talk about nothing. We just absolutely babble about nothing for 2 hours, and it makes no sense, and we don't know why anybody would listen to it, but apparently people do. But the thing I do want to tell you is about pre-ordering the book. So the book is going. The reason I want to tell you this is because you guys would really probably appreciate it. And some of you I know from the comments already have pre-ordered the book. Here's what I want to tell you. So you have 1 week left to pre-order the book, and you can pre-order it pretty much anywhere, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, whatever, local bookstores, Rainy Day Books. You can is my personal favorite bookstore in Kansas City, and you can pre-order a signed copy from them. But you can pre-order the book just about anywhere. Target, it's everywhere. And the reason I would tell you I would love for you to pre-order the book, there are two reasons. One, pre-orders are really important for writers. The pre-orders for this book have been incredible. I mean, just over the top incredible. And that has given me many, many opportunities that I wouldn't have gotten as far as media opportunities, as far as this tour. I'm going on a 22 city tour for this book. Pre-orders are really important. So there's that part aside. But the reason I want to tell you about it is if you pre-order the book and go to my website at joeposnanski.com, click on Joe Blogs, or I think it's on the website itself. If you pre-order the book, you can sign up to get bonus content from this book that you will get on the day I believe the book is published. So September 5th.
Yes.
And I just did it. I just put the bonus content together. It's 3 essays that did not make it into the book. One of them is the biggest baseball moment of my childhood, which did not make it into the book. Was one of the last to cut. One is an essay about George Carlin's baseball and football bit, which I loved so much and did not make it into the book. The third essay is written actually by Mike Shore, and it is about the greatest performance he ever saw live, which got cut from the book as well. So those 3 essays they've been put together in a PDF, and they will be delivered to your email box on the day of publishing. All you got to do is go to joeposnanski.com. There's a form there. Click the form, put in the pre-order number or whatever it is, just proof of purchase, and then fill it out, and you'll get that. So I do want to tell you that because I do think you guys would get a huge kick out of it. That's super duper fun bonus content that is a part of the book. So there you go. That's what I wanted to say.
Joe, huge thank you. SABR member Joe Posnanski. Folks, this book rocks. It's fabulous. You'll love it. You've got the right audience here, Joe. And I can't say thank you enough for sharing almost an hour and a half with us and telling us about it. I will say this, folks. The book oozes Joe's love of the game. And it's really the treat of the book is that it's so genuine, it's so sincere, and it comes through in the way that the words that he chose and the moments he chose. And Joe, we can't thank you enough for joining us tonight.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate all of you.
You got it. And thanks to Penguin Books for doing such a great job helping us with the PR for the event. Joe, thank you. And for everybody on this call, we appreciate it. Our next chapter meeting, Alex, if you could toss the date out. I'm sitting here in Iowa. I don't have my calendar in front of me. If you could talk about our next chapter meeting.
I believe if you're speaking about the third Wednesday of every month, sir, it'd be, I believe, September 20th. And it will be at Shoppers, I believe. That just still needs to be confirmed.
Fantastic. And Kurt and Alex will send out an email regarding that subject. Joe Posnanski and all the people who participated today and listened in, we appreciate your time on a Sunday night. Have a great rest of your weekend. Stay healthy and thank you.
Thank you.